long-run aggregate supply. Using the price level real GDP framework, long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS, turns out to be a vertical line. And we'll often call this with a star or an FE or a P. Or a P. So we usually P or FE. I often use FE. FE stands for full employment. Now, why is it vertical? The long run aggregate supply does not depend on the level of prices in the economy or the price level in general in the economy. Long run aggregate supply depends purely on long run real variables. Long run real variables are your labor, your capital, could be T for terra, or the size of your geography or your location, and also technology. So this one is technology, that one is land, that is capital, and this is labor. We tend to ignore land because economies don't usually expand because they conquered their neighbor, although that's why it's in there, or you could discover new territory. But we do think of labor, capital, and technology quite often. So we're going to think of the long-run aggregate supply as a function of technology, labor, and capital, and leave it at that. The technology in your economy, it can depend on your education system, it can depend on the level of scientific research in your economy, it can depend on the inventiveness of people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. But it does not depend on the price level in the economy. Okay? If your economy has more or less inflation, doesn't really affect whether it can produce better scientific ideas. Similarly, in the long run, your labor supply is entirely determined by population growth and your laws allowing people to work at different ages, allowing immigration, all of the kinds of laws that relate to the labor markets. Again, it doesn't really depend on overall price level and inflation in your economy. And finally, your capital stock. The capital stock in your economy is things like buildings, equipment, plants, roads. Those, again, don't depend on the price level. Now, that makes it this long run line here. And the reason we're going to like this line is because it's going to act like an anchor in our analysis. The fact that the long run aggregate supply curve is there and doesn't tend to move, at least in our basic analysis, makes it an anchor point for your economy. So we'll find that things move around in this graph and then always come back to land on this line. Now, full employment means this is lined up with what we would call the natural rate of unemployment. And the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment level that your economy exhibits once it's all working sort of perfectly and well and in equilibrium. That's what we think of as defining the long run. All the movement and adjustment is done, and where are we? What are we able to produce at the full employment level when we are at our natural rate of unemployment? Natural rate is basically resulting just from the fundamental frictions and structural issues in your economy, but it's not the temporary cyclical up and down of the unemployment cycle. So long-run aggregate supply is an anchor. In this analysis, it's sort of stable and everything moves around and comes back to it. We think of long-run aggregate supply as a function of, or depending on, three basic things: technology, labor, and capital. If any of those things increase, it would shift this to the right, And if any of those things decreased, like an earthquake might destroy some of your capital stock, it would shift to the left. New technology being developed will shift this out to the right. New population explosion would shift this out to the right, okay? But in most of our analysis, we're going to leave it stable and use it as an anchor.